In preparing this message, I was reminded of an expert musician who was a head violinist in an orchestra. He owned a rare Stradivarius violin, handcrafted in 1704 by Antonio Stradivari. Now, these violins are reputed even today to be among the finest crafted violins money can buy. In fact, I looked on the internet to see what recent sales of some of these are where there is public information. Between $1 million and $4 million, somewhere in that range, when they get sold. He said that this Stradivarius violin was so priceless that he really didn't own it himself, even though it was handed down from musician to musician to musician, again, since 1704. He said he was merely the caretaker of that violin, with the serious responsibility of passing it along to another when he died. But as long as he was alive, and that violin was in his custody, he was going to care for and protect that instrument most diligently. Now that lead-in brings me to a short psalm that speaks to stewardship and accountability of parents toward children. I won't turn, but it's Psalm 127, verse 3, a very well-known one. Psalm 127, verse 3 simply says, "Lo, children are the heritage from the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward." Well-known passage. If you've grown up in God's church or been in God's church for any number of years, you've heard this psalm. Well, as parents and grandparents, we've all been given stewardship of God's most precious possession, made or designed in the very likeness and the very image of God, and with the potential to become eternal spirit beings in the family of God forever. If you have reared children or are rearing children, you've come to learn by observation so many different aspects of a child's personality, and each one is uniquely different if you have several children, and a number of people in this audience do. Each one is going to be different. In their innocence, you've been able to watch them develop trust and a sense of fairness that seems like an innate quality of little children. You see their needs for love and affection. Then you come to understand, as they continue to grow, their hopes, their desires, their interests in life. Children teach us so many things. Now, all the parents in this room who have or are bringing up children are to be commended for the commitment you've made, because it's a very high calling, high responsibility, and a lot of work. But moms and dads both play crucial roles in bringing up children. Yet, there are no salaries, there are no bonuses being handed out for bringing up kids, diligently teaching them the right way of life. There are no medals of honor at the end of 18 years of hard work, sometimes longer, sometimes a little shorter maybe, for steering our children to adulthood. No medals of honor. In just the case of a mother's role, this is anecdotal, sometimes you see this. Salary.com is a website that renews and refreshes this information every year. It's all on human resources data. It asks the question every year, how much is a mother really worth in terms of dollars in a career, in terms of income? Well, in 2020, this is the latest I could find, they updated their annual study and estimated an annual salary of a mother by tracking real-time market prices of all the jobs that moms perform, what they should be earning in a marketplace. Okay, you ready for this? The result was that a median annual salary for a stay-at-home mom was $184,820. Sign me up, I'll play Mr. Mom. I'll do it for that for Mr. Mom. No, this is what they came up with, and that's an increase of $6,619 over the previous year, 2019. calculations. Well, what do they base that on? It sounds rather wild. Well, it's based on 107 hours, that's 107-hour work week, split between regular work and home work. Work meaning outside the home and work in the home. 107 hours. Well, this study gave consideration to the traditional roles like housekeeper, like dietitian, like daycare teacher. Newer roles, these get high tech. Newer roles also added like network administrator, social media communicator specialist, and recreational therapist, among many others, if you like fancy titles, okay? Among many others. But there are very satisfying rewards for our diligence that God promises when we teach our children the ways of God, that when they're old enough, they will not depart from God's ways. Proverbs 22, verse 6. Another wonderful delight is that it brings honor to parents and a delight to grandparents when children do mature and they become responsible citizens in society and family and church and community, and when they can hold jobs and they can care for their own families and support them. I mean, these things bust open the buttons of grandparents, especially when they see this. Such instruction is designed to make our children productive members of society with long, prosperous, happy lives. And add that bonus for believing parents that their children are sanctified by the believing parents, called and set apart for a special purpose to prepare them for life and to lead them to know God. These are wonderful promises that God points out in the scriptures. Okay, as stewards and caregivers of the most precious possessions God has entrusted with us, I'd like to share 7 important skills or traits that we should be striving to teach our children, to prepare them for life. My title today is simply, Parents Are Teachers. Parents are teachers. It's been a number of years since I've done a parenting or a child development sermon. So I dug into it. We're almost in midsummer. In about 2.5 months, school will start over again for a lot of our young people. And we're very blessed in this congregation to have, 10 boys and 1 little girl who are growing and developing and whose parents are really caring for them and doing a fine job. And I tip my hat, and God tips his hat to you as well. So what do we as parents and grandparents teach? I'm including grandparents here. We teach knowledge, we teach manners, we teach technical skills that can be things from tying their shoes, learning how to hold a fork or hold a pencil properly, answering a phone call courteously. I'll call those technical skills. We teach them values because values are so important. All right, I've already mentioned that we have special blessings for our children of believing parents because they're sanctified. But what do all the children in the world and children in God's church still have in common? Well, they have a number of things in common. Here are a few. Young children all go through the fastest, most curious, and most eager phase of learning in their whole lives when they're in those formative years. If you get to be my age and you say, I wish I could learn as fast as I did when I was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, etc., wow, I would have an IQ of 160 to 180 or 200. It's never going to happen. Not until I'm a spirit being. I hope that changes. But those years when our children are young, they're learning so fast. They're soaking up knowledge like dry sponges. And that's a very good thing. They're all unconverted, and there is some folly that always accompanies youth. God points that out in the Proverbs and other passages. But they are still very receptive and amazingly fast learners to God's laws and statutes. They can learn from such an early age, from the time they start developing language, principles of God. And they can be taught to a large degree the fruits of the Holy Spirit. in Galatians 5. From their earliest awareness, they're all forming lasting value systems through direct instruction, but they're also learning through example. Example is a very powerful teacher. Everything we parents and grandparents do in the sight of children is a loud and clear teaching. Everything they see us do when they're very young. We might say to a 7-year-old, son, how many times have I told you to put your seatbelt on when you're driving, when you're in the back seat of the car with me? A little boy, a 7-year-old says, but Dad, last week I saw you without your safety belt on. And so that's something where you have to stop. Your seatbelt, it's not on you, Dad. Son sees that. You have to just stop and say, okay, I was caught. All right, I'll sit in the doghouse on that one. We parents probably have all heard the well-known poem by Dorothy Law Nolte. The poem is titled, Children Learn What They Live. The irony is it's probably the reverse of that title. They live what they learn. But it's called Children Learn What They Live. Here are just some opening lines to the famous poem. If a child lives with criticism, he learns to condemn. If a child lives with hostility, he learns to fight. If a child lives with ridicule, he learns to be shy. If a child lives with shame, he learns to feel guilty. Now, after that, the poem goes into some very strong positive reinforcements. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but those were negative examples in this poem, Children Learn What They Live. But many times we parents can get into a routine of actually talking more than demonstrating. Both are very important. We instruct verbally, but also we teach by example. Both are important. Small children in the home see their parents as heroes, especially when they're very young, toddlers. Their whole world is centered around themselves and their parents. That's their sphere. Only when they get older, into their middle youth and then into teen years, they start branching out and seeing a much broader scope of the world around them. But the parents are heroes more than any action hero, any comic book hero, any movie hero, any sports team hero that you could comprehend. Parents are the ones that teach them so much. And the influence of the parents is right at the center of little children's lives. They can start to make the transition to honoring God as we teach them as soon as they start to have language development. And the framework of godly example of the parents plays into this as well. And so, yes, parents are human beings. Parents make mistakes. What parent in the world has never made mistakes raising children, rearing children? Zero. They've all done it. But we're going to look at these 7 points now, or 7 skills that I'll leave with you today. Number 1, we'll call responsiveness. Number 1 of 7 skills that we could be teaching our children is called responsiveness. Children should be taught to listen and respond to parents and superiors. Children should be taught to listen to and respond to parents and superiors. There's a beautiful story in the Old Testament. I'd like to turn there with you. It's about this childless wife named Hannah. I've talked about a different aspect of this family life last week. This is from 1 Samuel 3, verse 4. This is an aspect we didn't talk about. Remember, Hannah is one of the 2 wives of a man named Elkanah in ancient Israel. And Hannah is barren. She cannot bear children, but Peninnah, the Elkanah's other wife, has had multiple children already. Peninnah is very cruel to Hannah and ridicules and laughs at her, and it brings Hannah to huge grief and tears. Well, we turn over to 1 Samuel 3, verse 4. We see that Samuel is the firstborn of Hannah. And we see that Hannah already had devoted, if God should give her the blessing of a child, God would, or she would, devote him to God's duties and whatever God had in store for him for the rest of his life. And so she takes Samuel, when he's weaned, to the high priest named Eli at Shiloh. Shiloh was where the tabernacle was at the time. We can start to see just how receptive Samuel was to his calling as a little child. So here we are at verse 4 through 10. And we jump into the story where Samuel is also already under the care of Eli, the high priest. It says that in one night the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, "Here I am." So he got out of his bed and he ran over to Eli, and he says, "Here I am. You called me." Eli said, "No, I didn't call. Go lie down again. Go back to bed." And so he did. Little Samuel, we don't know how old Samuel is, but he's pretty young, we believe, here. Verse 6, the Lord, eternal, calls out again, "Samuel." So Samuel rose, got out of bed again, went over to Eli, said, "Here I am. You called me." He answered, "No, I did not call. Son, go lie down again. Go back to bed." Now, it says Samuel did not yet know the Lord, nor was the word of the Lord yet revealed to him. Verse 8, and the Lord called Samuel again a third time. He rose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you did call me." Eli's getting the message. He says, "I perceive that the Lord has called you, Samuel." Verse 9, therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and it shall be, if he calls you, that you must say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went, he lay down in his place. Now, this is interesting. If you read over it quickly, you notice that it's easy to miss. It says, verse 10, then the Lord came and stood and called out as in other times. So Samuel gets to see the eternal, the Word, the Logos, the one who would become Jesus Christ later. And he's standing there, and Samuel gets to see him. And so he says, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel answered, "Speak, for your servant hears." And the rest of the story is he takes a message to Eli that his sons have been egregiously misconducting themselves, and Eli has not taken care of the problem after being warned. But the focus of this part of the message here is that Samuel is learning to be very receptive and a good listener. That's the key point here. The Bible speaks of a teachableness that God can so easily work with throughout life if we're teachable. The Bible uses the word listen 153 times and in 150 verses. And it's mostly used in the Bible to express God's desire for people to listen to him so they might have a long and prosperous and abundant life. So again, most of the times the word listen in the Bible is used. It's for God to get the attention of people so that he can bless them and guide them. I won't turn, but James 1 verse 19, a reference, James 1:19. So then, my beloved brethren, James says, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. This is certainly a trait that can be started very young in life. And so once again, children should learn to answer when addressed by a parent or other superior. Another passage which is a reference, Isaiah 66 verse 2. This is the kind of heart and the kind of attitude that God finds pleasing and that God finds very easy to work with. Once again, Isaiah 66 verse 2. But on this one will I look. God's saying, this is the person that I'll work with. This is the person that I will pay attention to. On him or her who is of a poor and contrite spirit, who trembles at my word. The Good News translation, a lot more relaxed in its translation. It says, God says, I am pleased with those who are humble and repentant, who fear me and obey me. There's a companion verse in Isaiah 57, verse 15. Isaiah 57, verse 15, again a reference. God says, I dwell in the high and holy place, and with him who has a contrite and humble heart or spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. So this was the first of 7 skills or traits to be teaching our children. And that's to be responsive to parents and other people with legitimate authority. Number 2, self-control. Number 2, self-control is my second skill out of 7, or trait, to teach our children. This will assure our children have a balance in life, success in life, a sound mind in life. Self-control. Please do turn with me to Proverbs 16 and verse 32. We'll look at a number of passages in Proverbs as we go. Proverbs 16, verse 32. As you're turning, we all know that self-control can be found as the 9th of the fruits of the Holy Spirit in Galatians 5, verse 22. It's one of the fruits of the Holy Spirit. Everyone can learn it. You don't have to have a sanctified child that God is necessarily directing through life to have a child learn self-control. Everyone in this life needs to learn self-control as we learn emotional maturity. So what does it say in Proverbs 16, verse 32? It says, he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit is better than he who takes a city. You can find very powerful people on earth, but if they don't have self-control, a little child that learns to mind his manners and is tempered in how he conducts himself, he's better, God says. That's more power. That's more powerful. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. There are companion Proverbs. Let's turn to Proverbs 19, verse 11. Proverbs 19, verse 11. Let's read together. The discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook a transgression. Pretty much the same, isn't it? It's that God is showing that is a person that has stronger character traits if he can manage anger and controls his spirit. Proverbs 25, verse 28, another companion passage. Proverbs 25, verse 28. Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. It's tragic because in this world, in this life, there are many people that never learn this in their tender, formative years of life. Very sad and tragic, but that doesn't mean that they can't learn it later. It's just harder to learn later. You know, that's all part of God's calling out of rough circumstances for anyone in this world and anyone in this life who's had trouble and trial and had maybe parents that abandoned them. Maybe they're orphans. Maybe they've gone through horrible experiences and influences. God can still work with that person at any point through his Holy Spirit, transforming things that were missing. You know, when I was growing up, I didn't have a father in the home. And by my late teen years, I said, you know who my father is now? I'm not. My dad was alive, and my sister and I would see him several times a year, and it was always a wonderful occasion, but he just wasn't in the home growing up. But by the time I got to college, I said, my God is my father at this point in life. I call God my dad, even though I called my dad, but it was not having that same connection and closeness through many years growing up. So God became my father, and he was teaching me many things in my late teen years and early 20s that I would not have learned otherwise. And so God can do marvelous things. And so it's important for our children to begin learning early in life how to control and manage temperament, actions, behaviors. Self-control, like patience, is is the most valuable attribute. It takes many years of hard work and real life testing in order to perfect it. But the rewards are for a lifetime. Please turn to Proverbs 23, verse 12, because this is all related. Proverbs 23, verse 12. It's in regarding disciplining our children so that they do learn this beautiful fruit of self-control. And it is a fruit of the Spirit. Proverbs 23, verse 12, it says, apply your heart to instruction. Now, this is talking to young people. And your ears to words of knowledge. Apply your heart to instruction. Verse 13, do not withhold discipline from a child. Now it directs the instruction to parents. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish them with a rod, they will not die. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek when you read this, and I'll read the Good News translation. But it says, verse 14, punish them with the rod and save them from death. Now, Good News translation is, again, a very casual translation, verse 13 and 14. Don't hesitate to discipline children. A good spanking won't kill them. As a matter of fact, it may save their lives. That's in a little more modern vernacular. When you think of a rod, you think, that sounds scary. What's it made of? Is it made of hard cherry or hickory, or is it made of titanium or steel? You know what we're saying. Spanking, regardless what instrument it is, we don't do it to harm a child. We do it for their livelihood all the way through life. It says it may save their lives. Please turn to Proverbs 13, verse 24. This one uses a little stronger verbiage, but it's from the NIV. Proverbs 13, verse 24. It says, those who withhold the rod hate their children, but the one who loves his children applies discipline. Strong words from God's inspiration. The Good News Bible. Parents who choose to care for and discipline their children truly love them and are following the Lord's command. Again, a little more modern way of translating that. We know that since the 1960s in this country, there's been much controversy in our society about spanking as a form of discipline. Even with the church, within the church, we have hopefully struck a balance back in the 1980s and so forth, when we started seeing that there was wisdom to be sought in disciplining children, where sometimes some of the instruction was harsh and it may have caused more harm than good in the long run when it wasn't administered with God's wisdom and love. Hopefully we have matured as a people of God, and I think we have over the last several decades. Now, what happens in a society after just a generation or two of large numbers of youths who were not disciplined early in the home? Well, the impact is devastating. Jason Whitlock is a commentator. He's a journalist. He has a daily podcast named Fearless. And I went to listen to a podcast. He was also on Tucker Carlson Tonight on July 5th. And he was commenting on a question. Tucker Carlson asked him why he thought young men in particular were in such deep trouble in this country. This all was because of the 21-year-old mass murder of Robert Crimo, who climbed up to a rooftop in a nice town outside of Chicago on the 4th of July during a parade and shot 70 high-power rifle shells into the crowd below, killing 7 and injuring 30. And in one tragic case, killing both parents, and a 2-year-old boy was wandering aimlessly down the street looking for his parents until he was found and his parents are gone. Horrible, horrible thing. Well, Jason Whitlock answers the question that Tucker Carlson poses. He says, there's a problem with American culture. He says, we're looking at the ramifications of a culture rot, a culture rot, he says. I think there are a number of Americans, he continues, in the science crowd and the cultural elites who believe we're the smartest people in the history of the planet, and we're actually the dumbest, he says. We really think we have outsmarted God's natural order, that somehow we can put the development of children on the back burner. He said, if there's a problem with your kid, Pfizer has a pill that will correct it. If you're a woman, many believe the most important right you have is to be able to kill a baby in your own womb. That's a message, an indication of the mindset of the development and the cultivation and the nurturing of children that is not a priority in the United States. And he continues, he says, that's why these Robert Cremos and others like him are being created, because as a society we have put our children on the back burner. It is because of a couple of generations now, if not longer, maybe 30, 40 years of an increasing permissive society and neglect by parents to work with their children and love them and discipline them. Jason Whitlock went on to say how we've seen our society normalize behaviors that just a few years ago would have been considered completely antisocial, like tattoos on faces, like rapping about murdering people, spending countless hours on the dark web where there is so much evil and human depravity. And this is just surfacing and right at the aftermath of this Robert Cremo and what he was doing at home and his home life and what he did with his time. Jason Whitlock explains, the tragedy is the latest byproduct of a country that has rejected the biblical principles it was founded on and embraced a culture that glorifies violence, death, idolatry, and division. Our current culture will continue to manufacture Robert Cremos, again in quotations, the same way factory assembly lines produce SUVs. He added, if we don't return to some biblical values, the greatest experiment in human history is going down in a massive ball of flame, unquote. He says, I'm talking about America. He does conclude his podcast message by saying what is so true also. He says, America's only hope lies in a revival of biblical values and spiritual rebirth. So true, so true. It's very sad. Not Fox News online pointed out that his parents are under investigation for any culpability or accountability they might have had to help their son, 22 or 21-year-old Robert Cremo, to develop this kind of mindset. Witness accounts are being gathered from neighbors and people who know the family. One neighbor said, quote, the signs were there for a long time, unquote. A former football coach who worked with Robert when he was younger added, quote, there were always police cars at the house. The parents were arguing and fighting all the time, unquote. Very sad. Now, those are somewhat anecdotal, but you start to add things up. You start to add things up. My wife and I have enjoyed books by Dr. James Dobson for all of our children's upbringing. One particular book called Hide and Seek, How to Build Self-Esteem in Your Child. It gets right to the heart of a balanced approach and study on disciplining children and the emotional adjustment and self-esteem. A study of 1,738 boys from different backgrounds showed the differences between families who discipline children and their positive, healthy outcomes and the tragic outcomes of those who didn't. Dr. James Dobson wrote quite a few books on family growth and development. Dare to Discipline, we have that on our bookshelf. Bringing Up Boys, I've got that on my bookshelf. Parenting Isn't for Cowards, we have that one. And these are marvelous books. Some are still in print. Some can be bought very cheaply on used book sales. So number 2 out of 7 skills or traits to teach our children from the youngest age is self-discipline. which is also a fruit of the Spirit. My third out of 7 skills or traits to teach our children is discernment. Discernment. We can start teaching our children from a very young age. How? By teaching them right from wrong. What's good, healthy, what keeps you safe, what's dangerous, or what will harm you, or what will put you at risk. Please turn to Proverbs 3, verse 21, if you're still in that neighborhood with me. Proverbs 3, verse 21. This is, again, inspired by God, spoken by Solomon to young people. Solomon wrote this for youths to grasp. It says, "My son," verse 21, "let them, God's laws, not depart from your eyes. Keep sound wisdom and discretion. So they will be life to your soul and grace to your neck. Then you will walk safely in your way, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. Yes, when you lie down, your sleep will be sweet." Again, discernment is distinguishing between two things. Judging between right and wrong. It's the stuff that character is made of. A simple definition of discernment we learned at Ambassador College, so easy to remember, is knowing the right from the wrong and choosing the right over the wrong. Very simple, basic definition for discernment. Knowing right from wrong, which has to be taught first, and then choosing right from wrong. We start very early teaching our children to analyze a movie, a story, a real-life situation, and compare that against the standard of God's laws. And children usually come up with questions about such scenarios, and they develop an early sense of justice. Again, that might be something innate in little children, a sense of fairness and justice that they can comprehend very early on. One of the most rewarding compliments, and I forgot this until I read some notes I had from 2008 when I last gave this sermon, actually. One of the most rewarding compliments both of our daughters said to me when they were very young, and I hope I never forget it. And so I got a nice little reminder here. Now, my daughters might have forgotten it by now, but they both said to me, "Dad, we like to come to you when we have an argument or a problem, since you always try to be fair." Wow. That meant a lot. That poem that we started off with, "Children Learn What They Live," by Dorothy Law Nolte, it continues. It says, "If a child lives with encouragement, he learns confidence. If a child lives with praise, he learns to appreciate. If a child lives with fairness, he learns justice. If a child lives with security, he learns to have faith." So my third of 7 skills was brief here, but teaching children to understand right from wrong is the first step in teaching them accountability and responsibility for what they do in life. And again, it is becoming so lacking in Western culture, Western society. Number 4 out of 7. Acceptance of self and others. Acceptance of self and others. It's a skill or a trait to teach. And here I'm not speaking of pumping up a child's self-esteem unnaturally, which can lead to a very, very self-centered and narcissistic life. And a lot of children are of helicopter parents or those that have indulged their kids so much in the last couple of generations, they see those outcomes. I'm certainly also not speaking of the perversion of gender identity confusion being promoted among children and teens in schools and other areas of society. I'm not talking about that at all. That's a tremendous perversion going on that wasn't even talked about 10 years ago. But acceptance of self and others has to do with parents teaching forgiveness and mercy. It has to do with parents teaching forgiveness and mercy. Back to the poem once again. Children learn what they live. If a child lives with tolerance, he learns to be patient. If a child lives with approval, he learns to like himself. If a child lives with acceptance and friendship, he learns to find love in the world. I mentioned earlier that children are always watching their parents and to see if they measure up to the same standard. The parents set standards for their children. Children in a healthy environment want to live up to parents' expectations, at least early in life. Now, there is those teen years, and I was one. All of us that were older now went through teen years, and some were rougher than others. Some people were very compliant. Others had rougher times through those teen years, and parents, in some cases, spent a lot of time on their knees. A lot of time on their knees. My wife will tell you if you ask her. She'll say, "What were you like as a teenager?" And she'll say, "My mom and dad spent a lot of time on their knees. My mom and dad went to our pastor at the time and says, 'I want you to put our daughter out of the church.' And he was a very thoughtful pastor. He says, 'No, if I do that, I won't have a church. If I keep that same standard for everyone in this congregation, I won't have a church.'" So anyway, she'll tell you that. I'm not sharing any secrets. She hasn't told that story many times. But anyway, forgiveness and mercy come into play because we all make mistakes. The children do, the parents do. And we'll probably see times when parents react unfairly or overreact. The best thing to do in those cases is to go back and revisit that with an apology to our children. And the same is true for children that make an offense, that they need to learn how to ask forgiveness of their parents. It works both ways. We all react in life when sometimes we offend others, when we overreact. We're all human. We're all brought up in a carnal world with influences around us and human nature that cause these things. We all know, and God knows, that we all will sin. Here or there, we all will sin. But the whole fabric of a peaceful and productive society begins with a code of morality that parents are to teach children. Please do turn to Ephesians 6 and verse 1. I do believe I do not come back to Proverbs. You know what? I might ask you to put a marker there just in case. But Ephesians 6 verse 1 is a very important short passage on bringing up children. Ephesians 6 and verse 1, even if we're talking about a nation that doesn't believe in the one true God like you and I do, but at least has a code of morality and a sense of justice and law and order, there is, in even the most pagan of societies, a code of conduct that children are to honor their parents. Even if they don't have God's 10 commandments, they have a code of conduct in the most pagan societies in all of human history. Ephesians 6, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. When parents are living a godly life, they can expect the children to emulate and model after them. Verse 2, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. What is the promise? That it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. It's right out of the commandment. It is the fifth commandment, that you may live long in the land which I shall give you. Verse 4, and you fathers do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. I won't turn. Colossians 3, verse 20, Paul says something very similar to the Colossian brethren. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Then he says in verse 21, fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. The NIV says, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. So to provoke to wrath or to embitter your children, it's talking about unfair or humiliating treatment. This is not to say withholding punishment where punishment is due. It's not to break the spirit of a child, it's to break the negative will of a child, someone said. We don't want to break the spirit of a child, especially a tender, fragile part of a child's self-worth. And some children are much more sensitive and easy to offend than another. I'm going to shift just for a second. It just came to mind about, I don't know, 20 years ago, our daughters were very young, growing up in the home, and we had 2 dogs. We had a dog named Chester, a boy male dog that we got from a kennel. He was already a year old. He had bad manners and bad behaviors. He had so many things that he was not trained at all. And so he did so many things that got me so aggravated. And I could spank him, I could scold him, and it just like, whoosh, didn't mean anything to him. Tough as nails. A little tiny Bichon. Then we had another Bichon named Lacey, who we got from a little puppy. Much more moldable, much more teachable, much more loving, cuddly, one that would do anything for you. I scolded her once, and she hid from me for days. It was, I felt so bad. Now I'm using dogs as examples, but I'm showing differences in personality. Children can be that way too. Some are tough as nails, and some are so tender and so easy to comply and work with. It all depends. It all depends. There's an example on healthline.com. It's an article titled 5 Serious Long-Term Effects of Yelling at Your Kids. I just looked at one of them, number 2. 5 serious long-term effects of yelling at your kids. I wrote this one down. It said, of the 5 effects, researchers discovered that yelling changes the way the brain develops in a small child. Yelling and other harsh parenting techniques can quite literally change the way your child's brain develops. That's because humans process negative information and events more quickly and thoroughly than good ones. Now, there's something to be said for negative reinforcement to teach a child not to touch the hot stove, not to mess with the hornet's nest, not to jump up and down on a fire ant hill. Things like that. The child usually learns those things once and never again. And so those things are not to harm them for life. They just learn those things quickly. And then there's the positive reinforcement. One steady, trusted source compared the brain MRI scans of people who had a history of parental verbal abuse in childhood with scans of those who did not have a history of the same kind of childhood abuse. They found a noticeable difference physically in the brain, parts of the brain responsible for processing sounds and language. And that's showing that there are other behavioral aspects of harsh treatment and things that, as God pointed out, making your child feel their self-worth is gone, that they're really feeling, as God says, that we have gone beyond the balance of proper childhood training. I won't turn, but Jesus Christ in Luke 23, verse 34. Luke 23, verse 34, Jesus Christ himself has no limits on forgiveness, nor the Father in heaven. When the Roman soldiers were mocking and spitting and treating Jesus Christ with horrible cruelty during his crucifixion, he said, as he's hanging on the stake, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." They don't know what they're doing, he says. If our children do some terrible deed, we can't change the fact that maybe a child rode his bicycle into Dad's car and put a big scratch along the edge of it. It'll scratch the paint. We still accept the child with unconditional love. We're still going to find a way that's appropriate for that age to discipline the child. If they're older, maybe they could start saving money for for having the paint job fixed. Of course, that could cost $700, $800, and that could take a child's, 6 or 10 years of child's life. You know where we're going with that. Repairing a car is kind of like, you might just have to overlook that as a parent. You might have to overlook it. When we parents are forgiving of children's faults, and we seek their forgiveness for our own parental faults, we're teaching a tremendous example of God's endless mercy with us. Let's go on. That was number 4 out of 7. Acceptance of others and acceptance of self has to do with learning forgiveness and mercy. Number 5 out of 7, skills or traits to teach our children is having respect for others. Number 5, respect for others. This is teaching our children to have respect for other people's lives, for their property, for their rights, for their feelings. Showing honor where honor is due. First to parents and grandparents, then to other, again, legitimate figures of authority, then to everyone. I won't turn, but the passage in 2 Timothy 3, verse 1, very well-known one, it was revealed to Paul that societal ills would get much worse toward the end of the age before Christ's return. 2 Timothy 3, verse 1. We can see this more and more and easier with every passing year, how neglecting to teach our children on a national scale what kind of outcomes it's producing. In Robert Cremo's and others. Verse 1, Paul says, "But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. Men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." Society and its permissiveness is leaning in that direction with every marching year. I also won't turn, but in Romans 13, verse 1, Romans 13, verse 1 is a passage about let every soul be subject to governing authorities. And it talks about how rulers in society, those that are governors, those that have rule even from police officers to teachers in schools to magistrates and judges in courtrooms, that we're to give them the respect that God has placed them there for. And he says, do you want to be unafraid of the authority? This is again in Romans 13, verse 3. Do you want to be unafraid of authority? Do what is good, and you'll have praise from the same. For he is God's minister. This is those that wield the authority for capital punishment. He is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for does he not bear the sword in vain? For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, we must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience's sake. I remember when our 2 daughters were young, I'll harp back to that one more time on a very positive thing. It was 1992. Our daughters and Angela and I moved out of Southern California for a climate, and I don't mean that in terms of the humidity of the South in Alabama, but the social climate. To move out of Southern California to a peaceful little town in Alabama that was like Mayberry RFD. It was just a delightful little town. And our girls were young. They were attending a new schools there. They were learning some traditional Southern hospitality. And they started coming home with yes, sir, and no, ma'am, and yes, ma'am, no, sir. And I'm thinking, wow, we didn't teach them that. We didn't teach them that in Southern California. It wasn't part of my upbringing either. But they would come home with this kind of a cultural refinement. Now, sadly, we didn't reinforce the tradition all the way they're growing up because it just wasn't part of my upbringing, although Angela, she did grow up in the South. I was very impressed by it. It was just something that we saw as a courtesy of respect towards elders, toward their teachers. It was just wonderful to see that. That's just a little anecdotal thing as well. My fifth of 7 skills or traits is to teach children to have respect for others. I won't turn, but 1 Samuel 15, verse 23, the scenario is Samuel is up in age. He has already anointed Saul king of Israel. Later on, Saul was going to rebel against God, and he wasn't going to follow God in his instructions for him. He had changed. When he was small in his own eyes, God says, I could work with you, and he was doing things that were pleasing in God's sight. Later on in life, Saul took matters in his own hand. He rebelled against God. What did Samuel say to him? And this really hurt Samuel. 1 Samuel 15, verse 23. Samuel prayed all night long when God says, I'm rejecting Saul. And then he was going to point Samuel to another king, and of course it would be young David, who was just a shepherd boy out in the field when he came to anoint him. And a few years would pass, of course, before he took on the reins of leadership over Israel. But when Saul was being rejected, Samuel grieved heavily over it. He had to go back in person to Saul and say, this is what God says, Saul. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. Again, a very grievous day for Samuel to say those words to Saul. Our children definitely will be blessed when they learn how to respect and honor parents first in life. Number 6 is more brief, and number 7 is more brief. Number 6, a skill or trait to teach our children is to focus them on showing appreciation. Focus the children on becoming appreciative. William Shakespeare said one line in a play, King Lear II. In the play, he says, how sharper than a serpent's tooth is to have a thankless child. That was, again, a play that William Shakespeare wrote. Mr. Herbert Armstrong used to surmise that perhaps the greatest sin of our nation was the sin of ingratitude, especially in light of being the most richly blessed nation this world has ever seen. Our children are subjected to a dizzying array of material things in this country. Wants and desires, birthday presents, latest fashions, newest computers, smartphones, video games, toys, tablets, TVs, cars. We just live in a very materialistic society because God has blessed this nation so much. So our children should be taught from the earliest years to even appreciate the simpler, non-physical things in this life. Non-material things, I should say. Quality things that are not even possessions you could hold in your hand. The wonders of nature, from plant life to animal life, to a majestic view of a starlit night, far away from the sounds and the lights of the city. Being immersed into the beautiful sound of classical music once in a while, or singing voice. I personally have what I think is one of the most beautiful things that my ears have ever experienced, and that's the sound of a beautiful human singing voice. It's one of the most enjoyable things that I personally can think of. All of you will have some different aspect of something that you say, wow, I really appreciate this or that or the other thing. It's also reminding our children to thank mom for dinner or for doing the laundry or the housework. When the children of the scripture about the Proverbs 31 woman rose up and called her blessed, it's likely it's because dad probably had to prompt and prod the children for years to show mom some appreciation. Children do need reminding frequently, little children, for kindnesses and courtesies, and that skill only comes by training, and training starts with little things. They turn into bigger things as they grow older. So number 6 of 7 skills or traits was to teach our children to express appreciation. Number 7, my final one, is probably the most obvious of all. My 7th skill or trait is an absolute commandment from God. The Bible teaches what it is that tends to long life and security and prosperity. And what is that? Respect for God's word. Respect for God's word. Let's turn to one final passage in Deuteronomy 11, verse 18. Well-known passage. God is training ancient Israel before he leads them into the promised land. What is going to be right at the heart and core of prosperity, longevity, and that kings would always sit on their thrones, well, once they started having kings, it would be to honor and keep God's law and to teach our children from the youngest age. Deuteronomy 11, verse 18. Therefore you shall lay up these words of mine in your heart and in your soul, bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall teach them to your children, speaking of them when you sit in the house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, that your days and the days of your children may be multiplied in the land of which the Lord swore to your fathers to give them, like the days of the heavens above the earth. My conclusion today is simple. Parents are teachers. From the time a little baby boy is struggling to sit up or to hold a spoon in his hand, to the moment he's graduating from high school and heading off to college, every parent wants to say to him or her, son, whatever we've taught you, either you've learned it or you haven't by now. You're standing on your own now, and your decisions are your decisions. Make us proud of you. And may God bring you blessing for a lifetime. Once again, human beings are God's most precious resource, and God places enormous emphasis on the Scriptures on bringing up children that will be a blessing to parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, and society. We've been entrusted with the awesome privilege of stewardship of God's most precious possession. That is, children designed, again, in the likeness and the image of God, with the potential to become eternal beings forever. Just like the fine Stradivarius violin that was, in the words of one fine musician, just in his custody to protect and care for, and to exercise to its fullest potential, we too are, in a sense, preparing to pass our children back to our Creator when they reach adulthood. Henry Ward Beecher, an American author and clergyman, said, "When a child is born into the world, God draws his hand out from near his heart and lends something of himself to the parent and says, 'Keep until I come.'"